All right, good morning. Good to be together across 3 campuses. Those of us that did not go to Florida on spring break, we got each other, right? It's good enough. We're glad that you're here, and many of you still on spring break and making the most of it. Going to jump right in. We have a lot to cover. Heads up today. First-time guests, we're thrilled that you are here. Maybe you came because you heard we were going to talk about the area of mental health. It's been rampant, especially since COVID. And we believe the church should be on the front lines of offering hope and encouragement to people. And so we want to go all out. You know, I get overwhelmed in thinking about the number of journeys and circumstances that are represented in these 3 spaces right now. And I know that whatever I say today and over the next 5 weeks, it's going to be limited in how it can help you. So we want to provide as many resources as possible. You can find these handouts, the printed copies in the lobby. You can also go to the website or the Church Center app. One thing that we would love for you to do sooner rather than later is if you have any interest at all in being part of a mental health support group made up of people within our church family. Of course, anybody can join, but counseling is extremely important. But sometimes an easier next step is, hey, I just want to have a conversation with other people as a reminder that I'm not alone and share stories that way. So let me also give this caveat today because this is such a complex topic. Today we're covering specifically stress and burnout, which means as I go through this, naturally based on what you're going through or what you know other people are going through, you're going to be, what about? Well, you're going to have to come back. This is basically just one long message over the course of 5 weeks, okay? And so we're going to peel back those layers and address that. But today, as those what-abouts come to mind, know that we're talking specifically about stress and burnout. Now, I have a counseling background and have talked about this multiple times. Had no intention of ever becoming a personal object lesson for this area. Many of you know that was the case over the last year plus for me. So today, I'm going to share with you my story, and regardless of the topic, today's format's going to be different than most messages you would hear from me. And so this is not necessarily enjoyable, full disclosure for me. So my prayer is that through my transparency, vulnerability, hopefully relatability, that it will give people hope, right? I just pray that God will use this. I recently read that it is prideful and selfish not to allow others to enter into your suffering. It's like, whatever, I guess that's the case. Don't believe everything you read. So we're just going for it. All right, so let's start by going back to 2020. That was a good time. Specifically March of 2020, literally churches shut down. We're talking about COVID, in case anybody has been in the dark for a while. The pandemic, world pandemic, churches had to shut down. By far the most stressful time in ministry that I've had in now almost 23 years of ministry. And naturally that was the case for every pastor everywhere. Those of you also in the health, working in the health field and in medical and in education, right? It was extremely stressful to the point that there's something called the Great Resignation, right? For the pastoral world, which I'm familiar with. 42% of pastors in my role since 2020 have considered quitting, right? Because it just brought on just a level of exhaustion like none other. None of us took a class in college, called How to Navigate a Pandemic and Lead Your Church Through It. Like nobody knew what they were doing. There was no ideal. It was almost like we were in a contest of how many people can we disappoint. That's what it felt like, right? And over the course of 18 months to 2 years, I think we touched on everybody of every political bent because everything was political and everything was divisive and everybody was just, mad at somebody. And a lot of that was directed at, church leadership. You're doing this right. You're doing that wrong. So part of that was, frustration. Like, I've been here at First Church for almost 23 years and, surface level, sometimes political reasons for people switching churches because this church has this regulation. They're not doing this. And you're like, oh, man, just forget that frustration builds. And then as I processed, it just kind of turned into sadness. Like, oh, man. So 2020 was a brutal year, and then 2021 was a year of recovery and redefining church. Like, who are we going to be kind of in this new way of people, engaging or not engaging in church? So many people just stopped coming to church altogether, which led us to 2022, the year of the Together initiative. For those of you that weren't here then, it was a campaign for our Union Campus and Spiritual Growth Initiative that we're going to continue to give more updates on in the future. This is the first time of me being in this role, been in this role for now almost 8 years, of leading a campaign, which was just extremely exhausting endeavor but I was passionate about it and enjoyed it and loved getting to know more people in our church family, poured everything I had into preparing for this and executing it. During October and November of 2022, I saw my family, less than any other time since getting married. I was doing weddings and funerals and just a intense, crazy pace like I'd never experienced before. Fortunately, the initiative went well. You all were extremely generous. I was excited about the results, so I did not at that point take a break like I should have. And as I talk with the other lead pastors that I network with, and they ask me about my experience, this is one thing I strongly encourage them to do. I should have taken a break in that moment, but instead I just kept going. I preached Christmas Eve services, New Year's Eve, which hardly ever any lead pastor does. And then I was excited about our prayer series at the beginning of 2023. It was a 5-week series on prayer. I preached all 5 of those because in my mind, I'm going to get 2 Sundays off because I'm going on a mission trip to Kenya. Saying this out loud, I know it's ridiculous. Like, time off? I rationalized it because I wasn't leading. Part of my exhaustion was just decision fatigue, again, over a long stretch of time. And so I vividly remember halfway through being in this very spot, preaching at the 11 a.m. service, the 5th and final message on prayer, so January 30th, 2023. It was almost like a switch in my mind just turned off. Like apparently the tank had hit empty, the last of my adrenaline depleted. And so it was kind of confusing to me, right? I kind of stumbled through our Sunday night service that night. The next morning I woke up, I had a knot in my chest, right, that remained for almost a year. And I thought it was just from one of our kids, swinging and they kicking me in the chest or something like that. It was bizarre. I'd never experienced anything like that before. I went into the office that Monday. I vividly remember being out in the lobby talking to Jenny Leach, and I was like, man, I can't even carry on a conversation. I can't even think straight. Like, this is totally bizarre. I remember doing a hospital visit a couple days later and just experiencing lightheadedness, and I'm like, what is even going on? I just had no clue. And just being a part of meetings, not being able to process, like normal. So then the following Sunday, February 6th, was Super Bowl Sunday, which all of our campuses were combined. Some of you remember that. So February 6th, 2023, all church gathering. Before the services, we had a staff prayer time, and we were standing in a circle, and I remember just kneeling down, and I was just like, I can't even hardly function. My mind and body were just so depleted. Now, I had a shorter message prepared, for that day, so I thought that I could get through it. The reality was I couldn't. I stumbled through the 9:30, and, it was pretty obvious to everyone, and 11 o'clock, right, I had to call an audible, and you couldn't come back on. And I came to find out later that at that 9:30 service, February 6th, I basically had a panic attack on stage. And it was a totally bizarre experience to me, but processing later, that was what happened. So needless to say, I did not go to Kenya. So many people said, hey, you're not going. They would have waited at the airport and said, no, turn around. Later found out that I had developed an anxiety disorder due to stress and burnout over the course of a long period of time that built up to that. So I thought just taking a few weeks off from everything would be enough. Right? This is brand new territory for me. It wasn't. I tried to scale back on preaching, but still work throughout the week, which led to attempting to preach Easter of 2023. And I just stumbled through Saturday night at 5 o'clock, Sunday morning 8. I told Randy even before 8 a.m., I was like, I don't think I'm going to make it throughout today. So he prepared to render that 8 o'clock. And, those of you that were here, which would have been a lot of you, 9:30 and 11, and that night watched the message that I stumbled through on video. And so it was obvious to everyone that I was still depleted. So the elders graciously told me at that time to shut it down for 3 to 6 months to do whatever it takes to refill my tank. Just so much grace. At the end of 3 months, right, just, long stretch of time, and I'll talk more, in the future about what I did during that time off. At the end of those 3 months, I wanted to come back because I just felt so guilty for taking so much time off and just wanted to find out right away if I was okay enough to get back into things. And if I wasn't, well, I would know, you would know, and we'd all just move on, right, for the sake of everybody. Well, the counselor I was working with at the time, the elders, by the way, didn't even leave it up to me to say, hey, I'm good to come back. They said, no, we want to hear from a professional, and this is a guy in his mid-70s who specializes in counseling pastors. He said, Darin is not ready. I think his recommendation was that I should take 3 more months. So just a very humbling moment in time. So you guys remember those updates. elders continue to be extremely supportive. Matt Freeman, one of our elders in that meeting, when we were talking through what the next 3 months are going to look like, he said, Darin, we wouldn't expect for you to come back yet if something was wrong with you physically, like if you got diagnosed with cancer and were having treatments, or if you had a heart attack. So it was encouraging perspective, because this is part of the stigma of mental health and mental illness, right? It's just not looked at the same. So that helped me a little bit. You all, right, church family, our staff continue to be extremely gracious, patient, so encouraging. I'm still so grateful. I mean, you guys just fill my tank, and I'm just having a single thought about your love and support of me. So 2 more months went by. I then slowly started to re-enter back into the office and amongst the staff, attending meetings. And then the strategy was the last part to be added as far as my re-entry plan was preaching. Now, I wasn't confident at all at the time that I was going to make it back, because much of my anxiety was around being in front of people. And even, part of this is my core personality, right? Many of you have heard I'm an introvert. I don't really gain anything from, I'm not comfortable with a lot of attention being on me, right? Makes this moment kind of awkward right now. You all just staring at me. Acknowledge the obvious thing. So part of it was my core personality, but a larger part was because of what happened on stage February 6th. A terrifying and paralyzing moment captured and remembered by my mind and body. So it wasn't just being up front, like no joke. At the time, even if someone would have asked me to pray out loud in a group setting, my mind would have screamed, run. Like I would just had escalated anxiety in the moment. It was just a totally bizarre experience. So the plan of action at that point was exposure therapy. So I was working with one counselor who works with pastors, another counselor, helps navigate anxiety. So in working with Mike Miller, one of our elders, met with him regularly. And so exposure therapy, the plan was a series of small steps, putting myself in front of people. The first was our Sunday night service, our trio service. This would have been back in late October. Simply giving people a personal update and closing in prayer. That's it. And like my body was screaming inside. My mind was just saying, run. The second step, but I pressed through. The second was our student ministry retreat, which any of you that were there, you're like, wait, what? That was happening? My task was simply to lead an icebreaker up front, introduce the speaker. People there had no idea. My mind was telling me to run, right? I was kind of freaking out in the moment, which just sounds crazy. I then hosted services over the course of the next 3 weeks, right, at all 3 campuses, and eventually preached for the first time since Easter on Thanksgiving weekend. So back end of November last year was the first time I preached. It was a shorter message. So when I woke up, each of those Sunday mornings, right, over the course of a month to host or preach, I would be at home, my mind would be racing, right? I would walk into my closet to figure out what I was going to wear, and I would just be paralyzed by the moment. Like, I can't do this. I was convinced I couldn't pull it off. I was done. I'm going to have to do something different with my life. I'm thinking about updating my resume. And so each of those Sundays, I went out the front door. I ran up and down the sidewalk, hoping the cold weather would just shake it out of me. And so I literally forced my mind and body to do the opposite of what it wanted to do. I tortured myself and did the exact opposite, right? I remember pulling into the parking lot and just sitting in my car like, I can't do it, but putting one foot in front of the other until I was standing in front of you all. And most people had no idea. And so, I kept thinking about how often I tell, my 5-year-old son, Levi, do hard things. That was one of my motivators in my mind. Do hard things. Do hard things. Andy Colbert wrote a book that was significantly helpful to me. I read it over a year ago. The book's called Try Softer. She said the hard things that cracked us open have the potential to create space for deeper joy and resilience. She said our capacity to be alive grows as we learn to process and move through hard things. Now, some of you know how competitive I am and how I hate losing more than I love winning. So I basically made an enemy of my mind. I don't know if that's what reverse psychology actually is, but I was like, no, you want to do this? My body wants to do this? No, I'm going to do this instead, and kind of willed myself. So last week, Easter Sunday, amazing day of celebration across all campuses, and just, internally, even for me, a finish line, finally getting past kind of that year mark of no longer having to think, well, a year ago that happened, a year ago that happened. And I could have easily jumped ship several times along the way, but what motivated me to keep battling was the incredible patient support of our elders. I was motivated by you all who encouraged me and cheered me on all along the way. So many cards, so many encouraging words sent. So many of you said, and this surprised me the first time I heard it, but it just blessed me in an incredible way. So many of you said, we care more about you as a person than as a pastor. So that was an unbelievable gift. We care more about who you are than what you can do for us. And so many people said that. It's incredible love that overwhelmed me in the best way possible. And then our staff, who I love so much and I'm just so grateful for more and more every day, they carried the load for a long stretch of time. My time off was a challenging stretch for them. I was grateful for them while I was out, so much more grateful for them when I came back. And so just another opportunity to say thank you to everybody who journeyed with me. Now, even though a large part of why I burned out was because of unsustainable rhythms, I do believe that me being knocked down was also a form of God's care and grace. I believe sometimes God knocks us down to grow us up. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel like care. It doesn't even feel like a good plan, right? I'm not even confident about trusting in it. But I would have been more concerned if God just kind of let me go, living out too much of my own competence and independence. When he's knocking me down, say, Darin, if you really want to be useful for the kingdom over the long haul, you need to grow independence on me. I vividly remember reading Psalm 23 over a year ago in a new light, specifically the part where it says, he makes me lie down in green pastures, learning to abide in him, the source of actual strength. So again, looking back, I would have been more concerned if he didn't disrupt me and allowed me to continue working too much from a place of competence alone. And so I view that as a form of God's care. I'm partly responsible, obviously, as I just walked us through. But here's what I also learned. Sometimes God allows us to come to the end of ourselves so that we might be more useful in his service. That is not a good time, but it's a time we must be grateful for because it means he has more in mind for us. Isaiah 43:19, I read this Easter of 2023 as I was living it and could not see a way out, but now I read it in a new light. For I am about to do something new, God says. See, I have already begun. Do you not see it? I will make a pathway through the wilderness. I will create rivers in the dry wasteland. That's a promise to hold on to. Let me be more specific. 3 reasons why I've been able to bounce back. 3 reasons. Number 1, repetition of facing fear in attempt to disarm the fear. You know, along the way, I heard someone say, if you have a fear of spiders, at some point you have to hold a spider in your hand. Well, that's not a good time. That's literally terrifying. But there's no other way around. Andi Kolber, author Try Softer, she said this, healing looks like compassionately turning toward difficult experiences and providing resources that communicate to our bodies that it's safe to feel what we feel. That's hard work. Author James Baldwin, he said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So even though I wanted to run the opposite way, I was determined to run toward it. Now, the second reason why I've been able to bounce back, and this is something, right? You talk about the stigma of mental health. You know, several years ago, it was not even talking about it, and I'm going to jump into a different area. I'll touch on this briefly, and I will come back to it in coming weeks. The second reason why I was able to come back is I started taking a low dose of the generic version of Zoloft. And this was something that I waited as long as possible and trusted wise counsel, right, that spoke into my life, and I wanted to do everything that I possibly could. And really, this low dose, it takes the edge off, even just like in social anxiety type settings and groups and a little bit, being up front. But more specific, and so this is what I'll clarify more in weeks to come because there is a stigma around this. Medicine is not meant to be the full thing of your treatment, right? It simply, and this specifically, opens up your mind so that you can better do the hard work at discerning and chipping away at those core issues. And this is, I'm stating the obvious, but this is something that you obviously need to navigate with your counselor and doctor because every single person has a unique set of circumstance. But that's obviously a transparent thing I'm not entirely, comfortable with, but my goal is to encourage and equip you. And what I realized when I started taking it and started working, I noticed a difference. And it was interesting when I noticed the difference because it was affirmation that the problem wasn't just in my head. You ever been there? Like part of me was like, it's probably just in my head. Like you just need to get it together. Like I would constantly kind of trash talk myself. Like, dude, what's your deal? Like it's kind of like this out of body experience. Like, pull yourself together. And the answer wasn't just get it together. The third and the biggest reason why I've been able to bounce back is because God let me. God let me. More specifically, God has sustained me. See, there was no part of me holding tightly to a position, saying, no, this is what I'm going to do. I was open to him saying, go there, you're done, do this other thing now. But he didn't. He helped me get back up and ready for the next chapter where he already had me. Because he's God. He could have at any point said, no, that exposure therapy sounds nice, not going to let it work. Medicine, not going to let it work. Not going to put the right people around you. But he allowed me, and so I'm paying attention to his work in my life. And even in just these past few months, we've been in a really fun stretch with a lot of great momentum. Staff and congregation morale is better than ever. We're just a couple positions away from our team being fully complete and just really, really rock solid. We, just over a month ago, had 51 kids dedicated to God, which I'm still not really sure how that happened. Record attendance this past month in the elementary area, highest Easter attendance in 5 years. Which is interesting because all the while, our focus has been on prioritizing relational connection and spiritual depth over just doing things that get a lot of people to come. Right? If you're a first-time guest, that's kind of who we are. You'll hear me often say we don't just put on services. We don't, have a lot of programs and events that are attractional that just get a lot of people come, and we feel good about our efforts because a lot of people come. No, we're probably going to annoy you if you want to slip in and slip out because in large churches it's easy to do that, but we want to establish a culture that feels small. Meaning we want you to be connected. And that's the drum that we'll continue to bang. It's a no-compromise area because we want to create highly relational environments where we're all growing together in Christ-likeness. So what have I learned along the way? What am I continuing to learn along the way? It's okay to not be okay because God never asked you to be okay. He never asked you to be okay. Jesus actually said the opposite is required. 2 Corinthians 12:9. Jesus said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. The more we want to stand on our own, the less we leave room for God to bring his power into our life. Wayne Cordero is a pastor who experienced burnout several years ago and wrote a book called Running on Empty. He's a pastor in Hawaii, by the way. It's like, come on, man. Get it. Anyone susceptible, apparently. Here's what he said. This is helpful. I read this just over a year ago. He said, God's ways are certainly not our ways. And all too often, before the truth sets you free, it will make you miserable. We dare not conclude that what we are going through lacks the divine touch simply because it entered our life without our permission. And then he said, faith is living in advance what we will only understand in reverse. It's like, in that moment of torture, God, I don't know what you're doing with this. I feel like I'm just done, and frankly, part of me wants to be done, but I'm stepping forward. It was a challenge. And as we work on this together over the next 5 years, I want us to keep these truths in mind. Number one, you're not alone. Even if it's just you and me, right? Even if I'm only talking to one person in Campbell County, one at Union, if it's just you and me, you need to know you're not alone. That's a big deal. Secondly, life is hard. Life is hard. Thirdly, faith is a battle. If you're following Christ in a broken world, there is no arriving. There is no comfort to get to where it's smooth sailing. You're not alone. Life is hard. Faith is a battle. Now, I want to take the rest of our time to get specific, but again, still going to be more whatabouts to qualify that. But I want to clarify what mental illness is, right? And some of you are navigating this personally. All of us need to be navigating this with a posture of being equipped to help other people. So mental illness is a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder that can range from no impairment to mild, moderate, severe impairment, substantially interferes with or limits one or more major life activities. So this could be generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, social anxiety disorder. But to be clear, I also want to qualify this. In this series, we're mostly focusing on mild and moderate mental illness due to the extent of help needed for severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia, bipolar, major depressive disorder, bulimia, anorexia. And I listed post-traumatic stress disorder in both because it could be something like what I went through. I hate to just toss that around. And my life coach at the time called it small t trauma, like having an anxiety attack on stage. That would be small t trauma and me trying to get back into that same environment. You have some PTSD. But it can also be severe mental illness. What I went through that pales in comparison to what other people, maybe some of you have gone through, in experiencing something traumatic that brings on major T trauma with PTSD. However, it is worth mentioning that 1 in 25 adults struggle with serious mental illness. In 2021, this is the most recent comprehensive study I found, more than 1 in 5 adults were dealing with mental illness. So 20%, right, potentially of these three spaces we sit in right now. 1 in 3 young adults, ages 18 to 25. 1 in 4 adults, ages 26 to 49. And then 15% of people ages 50 and older. Maybe something to learn by the people who found some stability, which research says some of the happiest people in the world are in their 60s and 70s. And so it's interesting to think about each life stage and what we navigate and the challenges, especially that our digital day and age offer. Now, some root causes of mental health challenges are important to understand, because I don't want to assume that everybody here knows exactly how you got to here in your struggle. For some of you, it was situational or circumstantial. You maybe have experienced a loss of a job, even more extreme, loss of a loved one, going through divorce, even moving, right, and all the changes that come from that. For some of you, it's biological. This is in your family history. Right? Your physiological makeup makes you more prone to this. For some, it's medical, right? Going through sickness, especially prolonged sickness. You received a diagnosis, right? You talk about feeling that pit in your stomach, right? And it's experienced throughout your body. Spiritual, right? You go through, I'll talk more about this next week, kind of an existential midlife crisis. Spiritual warfare, right? There's more going on. We're going to talk more about this as well. That we're not just living life and smooth sailing and expecting everything to work out. But so it can come from a variety of areas. But stress and burnout, let me clarify, are not in and of themselves considered mental illness, but they are wide open doors that can lead to it, like it did for me. So better understanding stress, which we know what it feels like and looks like, it's simply a state of mental tension caused by a difficult situation. Stress is a natural response, right? It can help us. But too much stress over time can cause physical and mental health problems. Again, we also know that stress is not isolated to the mind, it's felt in our bodies as well. You have a sympathetic nervous system that prepares the body for any potential danger and activates the fight or flight response, right? That's one part of our nervous system. So past trauma can become a trigger. For me, being in front of people, the system lets me know that running off the stage is the best strategy to stay safe. Why would you do that? Why would you, right? That's what's happening physiologically in me. That's why it's kind of an out-of-body experience. It sounds crazy. Apparently 1 in 5 people know what I'm talking about, though. You're like, yeah. But the 4 out of 5 of you are like, yeah, that sounds crazy. Me too. It's kind of this out-of-body experience. And so what's interesting is this is not a conscious decision. It's your body's best attempt to neutralize what it believes to be a threat. So next week I'll talk more about how I personally navigate this. Then, as far as your nervous system, you have a parasympathetic nervous system that aims to bring the body to a state of calm. And here's where it's so important when it comes to our bodies being prepared to resolve mental health, anxiety. The vagus nerve is the main component of the system. It's the longest cranial nerve in the body, running from the brain into the face and ears, down to major organs in the chest and abdomen, including the heart, lungs, intestines, and stomach. Which is interesting because the vagus nerve registers like heartbreak and gut-wrenching feelings. Right? You're like, wow, stress is definitely not just in the mind. I'm feeling this everywhere. So when a person becomes agitated or upset, the throat gets dry, the voice becomes tense, the heart speeds up, respiration becomes rapid, your breathing is kind of shallow, and being able to activate the vagus nerve through breathing exercises and prayer, but also even diet, sleep, and exercise, right? I learned that lack of sleep was my direct contributor to anxiety, right? When I was in my 20s and 30s, didn't prioritize sleep a whole lot, and there's certain things you just can't get away with, right? When you get older that you could before. So prioritizing some of those basics. Neglect of these things, and you're less able to cope with stress, because stress can then lead to burnout. See, the thing with burnout is we all have what's called a window of tolerance. Andy Kolber addresses this as well. It came from a guy named Daniel Siegel originally. A window of tolerance, or a stress threshold. Different for all of us, but think about it this way. This window is kind of like an empty glass, and stress represents the water that fills it. As long as the glass is less than full, we can contain the water, manage the stress. But when this metaphorical cup overflows, stress overwhelms our coping mechanisms, and our fight, flight, or freeze responses kick in. So for me, right, my window of tolerance, this cup, pandemic in 2020, right, filled it up a little bit. Having a second kid in 2021, filled it up a little bit. 21 and 22, spent way too much time, right, in my position in management mode versus leadership mode. Some of you in business know exactly what I'm talking about. I was over-involved trying to help staff through personal and professional things, troubleshooting multi-site challenges. Then came the campaign, didn't take a break, preached too much, cup overflowed, throw a midlife existential crisis in there for extra fun as well. Not in a good place, right? So chronic stress, right, over the course of time is what can lead to burnout. And then what's happening within us, right, there's a chemical called serotonin. It's a chemical, it's like an endorphin, right? Meant to feel good. It's a natural feel-good hormone that replenishes during times of rest. That's why, right? Rest is spiritual. And then it fuels you while you're working. If, however, you continue to drive yourself without replenishing, your store of serotonin will be depleted. And as a substitute, your body will be forced to replace the serotonin with adrenaline. Adrenaline's fun, right? But it doesn't last forever. The problem is that adrenaline is designed for emergency use only. It's like those doors in a restaurant that when open cause an alarm to sound. Our problem, though, is that we use these pathways designed for emergency only, but no alarm sounds. Not at first, anyway. Should you continue to run on adrenaline, it will destroy your system. You'll burn out sooner on the inside than you're able to see on the outside. The fuel of adrenaline that keeps your engines running in the beginning will turn on you and destroy you in the end. This is what happened to me at the 11 a.m. service on that last Sunday of January last year. Tank hit empty, felt like a switch just went off. So it's important to know, like if you're navigating this, discerning, am I on the way to burning out? Here's some warning signs. Difficulty sleeping, lethargic, exhausted, persistent feelings of nervousness, right? Assuming you haven't had these before. Sometimes even escalating into full-blown panic, irritability, moodiness, cynicism, anger. Right? This is not the time to turn to your neighbor, especially if it's your spouse, right? These might be symptoms of something else too, but it's important to know, like, hey, where am I around the spectrum? And so naturally, going through hard times reveals our threshold, our red flags, and our opportunities for growth. So an area of weakness for me, and something that maybe some of you can relate to today as a cause of your stress that I've had to work on, is an overdeveloped sense of responsibility. Literally, when I stepped into this lead pastor role, one of our elders had me take an assessment, and this was one of the results. I'd never heard this before. Overdeveloped sense of responsibility means I have a tendency of saying yes to too many things and to too many people. I'm a 9 on the Enneagram, for those of you that are into the Enneagram. Or of rescuing instead of allowing someone to feel the fullness of consequences and accept responsibility. I can fight this even in parenting as well, which means if you're on my team and you make a bad decision or you fail in some regard, like I'll orchestrate a set of circumstances in my mind that I'm partly responsible. Like, if I would have led them better, if I would have been there for them, if I would have helped them, they would have fallen, right? It's kind of this coddling, even this overdeveloped sense of responsibility. Recently read something that kind of put it in perspective. This guy said, "You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm." That's pretty good insight. It's the whole plane, put the mask on first kind of thing, right? So to state the obvious, many of you are further along at this than me, I've had to become more intentional about having necessary boundaries. Naturally, Jesus is a pretty good example of this. Notice Mark 1:35. Before daybreak the next morning, Jesus got up and went out to an isolated place to pray, right? Taking time, priorities. Later, Simon and the others went out to find him. When they found him, they said, "Everyone is looking for you." Right? And that moment, you ever been there? Feel some pressure, like I got to be there for other people. But Jesus replied, "We must go on to other towns as well, and I will preach to them too. That is why I came." So he traveled throughout the region of Galilee, preaching in the synagogues, casting out demons. Mark 10:40, this is interesting. Jesus says, "I have no right to say who will sit on my right or my left. God has prepared those places for the ones he has chosen." He didn't even feel pressure to have all the answers. When I came back from being off, naturally, there's a lot of things I didn't know about as far as what was going on around here, which means I've gotten pretty comfortable saying, "I don't know," as an attempt to better lean on my team members more. Last one, Matthew 19. One day, some parents brought their children to Jesus so he could lay his hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples scolded the parents for bothering him. But Jesus said, let the children come to me. Don't stop them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who are like these children. He had deep convictions about who he was and what he was called to. Which brings to the question, who has God called you to be? You have to clarify this in your life, in your context. What can you do that no one else can do? That'll help you clarify how you need to narrow your focus. At home, as a spouse, as a parent, in your position at work. On the flip side, what are you doing that anyone could do? Stop doing it. Delegate. No one is called to do everything. See, setting boundaries is not selfish. Instead, it's respecting yourself enough so that you can actually be the most helpful and focused person you could be. I paid the price. I was out of commission for a while. Therefore, I wasn't able to help people in the way that I'm passionate about helping people. See, the reality is depleted people, although well-intended, minimize their helpfulness. Even though we know we should be setting boundaries, what often keeps us from doing so are the feelings of dread, anxiety, and shame that come with disappointing people. The type 9 Enneagram can have people-pleaser tendencies. So my greatest regrets, full disclosure, are not bad sermons preached. I trust you guys have a lot of grace for that. My greatest regrets are not bad leadership decisions made. My greatest regrets in ministry are letting people down or not being there for them. Literally still keeps me up at night years later. I struggle with the problem of perfectionism and unrealistic expectations for myself. Those series of events and circumstances and unsustainable rhythms that led up to my burnout, like the elders, nobody else is saying, hey, you have to preach this number of times. I have higher expectations for myself than anybody else does. That was on me. And so what I've learned and what I'm learning is this: have grace for yourself. Have grace for yourself. I'm going to talk about this more next week. The problem of negative self-talk. Andy Kolber said she finds that self-hatred and contempt is the most pervasive reason people continue to white-knuckle their way through life. She mentions that many of us have an internal voice that is keeping us stuck, traumatized, unhappy, and alone, as the voice reminds us that we are not enough, not worthy, too much, and too little, all at the same time. What if this intense dislike of ourselves, though, is keeping us from embracing the truest thing about each of us, and that is our belovedness and our belongingness to God? More on that next week. Big picture perspective, we close today. Big picture perspective you need to have is this: your struggle is worth it for the sake of a purpose beyond yourself. We're not looking to overcome for the sake of overcoming because you can live your best life now. Your struggle is worth it for the sake of a purpose beyond yourself. Charles Spurgeon, a preacher in the 1800s, suffered a lifetime battle of depression, but he viewed his depression as a means of equipping him to minister more effectively. He said this: I would go into the deeps 100 times to cheer a downcast spirit. It is good for me to have been afflicted that I might know how to speak a word in season to one that is weary. I hope I never go through this again, but I wouldn't trade it for anything if it means the opportunity to impact and help people more. That's why I'm doing this, not because I like to, this is my 5th different position. I didn't aspire to this. As I mentioned, I don't thrive in being in a certain lead position or being in front of people. My passion is preaching the word of God and helping people grow in Christ-likeness. And this is a means to that. And if now my life experience takes the lid off on that, so be it. My mom said countless times over the years, don't waste the pain. Don't waste the pain. Author Brendan Manning, he experienced his own personal struggles over a lifetime. He said, in a futile attempt to erase our past, we deprive the community of our healing gift. At the end of each service, at each campus, we'll have the prayer team down front, and this is hopefully a wide open door for you to say, hey, me too. Maybe you've never had this conversation with anybody about your struggles. Maybe you've never taken the first step in saying, hey, I can't stand on my own. I need Jesus, and I'm realizing that more than ever before. I want to take a step toward him, knowing that I'm surrounded by other broken, imperfect people on this journey with me. Alan Noble wrote a book called On Getting Out of Bed. I read this last year as well. He said, if you refuse to have grace for yourself or to accept help from others, you will fall deeper into despair and have less and less strength to care for those around you. There's a lot at stake. It's your life, it's your well-being, but it's also your ministry. We are all called to leverage our life experiences for the sake of impact and helping people come to know Jesus Christ as Savior and Lord. That we're all on this journey together. Let me close with Psalm 116. David went through his own personal struggles, cried out to God. He said, I love the Lord, for he heard my voice. He heard my cry for mercy. The Lord is gracious and righteous. Our God is full of compassion. The Lord protects the unwary. When I was brought low, he saved me. Return to your rest, my soul, for the Lord has been good to you. For you, Lord, have delivered me from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before the Lord in the land of the living. I trusted in the Lord when I said, I am greatly afflicted. Just say it out loud to him. During this next song, as we enter into a time of reflection, right? These lyrics, I pray they resonate with you. Express them as your own personal longing to God. God, I want you. You are my source of strength. And at any point during this song, I would encourage you to take communion. If you're a first-time guest, hopefully you received a communion packet when you walked in. Top flap gets you to the bread, the second to the juice. This is the central part of our service because it represents the fullness of our hope. You cannot show up navigating mental illness and read a book about 7 steps to a better life or figure out the best self-improvement plan. It is only through the source of Jesus, his grace and his strength that sustains us. He went to the cross. His body was broken. That's what the bread represents. He shed his blood. That's what the juice represents, to cover your sin, which means we have the opportunity to walk in the fullness of hope. He has value for you. Let the cross represent that today. God, we thank you for meeting us where we are, in our pain, in our struggle, in our suffering. God, I pray that there isn't one person here that lets their current circumstance or level of emotion make them feel, or believe, I should say, distant from you. Help them to hold on to the truth that we just heard from David, that you are more near than we could ever imagine. You're carrying us when we don't realize it. You have a bigger vision for our life than we could even imagine. And God, we're trusting that you take us there. We want to experience rest in this moment in you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.